The Science Basement!
Hello and welcome to the Science Basement podcast, a podcast for people who love all things science. I'm your host Rhiannon.
And I'm your co-host Emmi.
So everybody knows about fossils, from the small shells to the huge dinosaurs on display in natural history museums all around the world. But what about the researchers that study them? And how can fossils be used to predict changes in our current ecosystems?
To talk us through this topic is David Polly, a visiting professor in evolutionary paleontology at the University of Helsinki, and otherwise based in Indiana University, Bloomington, USA. Welcome to the podcast, David. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you here. It will hopefully be a very interesting episode. I guess the good place to start is really to define what paleontology is. It might be a word that people have heard or maybe have no clue what it means. So let's start there.
All right. Paleontology, I guess in its most general sense, is the study of ancient life. And then usually specifically, it's distinguished from archaeology or anthropology, which is the study of humans, ancient or near ancient. And sometimes it's distinguished from paleobotany, which is the study of ancient plants. But I would use paleontology for both plants and animals. So study of ancient life.
Okay. So I guess people would probably know these, going back also to the introduction, as fossils. Is all fossils like part of paleontology, or is there also other things that it can include?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in fact, there's all sorts of technical and legal debates about that. But generally speaking, I would say a fossil is the remains of some past life. And sometimes it's part of the animal itself or the plant itself, like a tooth or a bone or a leaf or something like that. But sometimes there are also things like trackways, like dinosaur trackways, that aren't really part of the organism directly, but they are something very closely related, and somewhere in that gray area is what a fossil is.
So you mean like footprints?
Yeah, like footprints.
Okay.
Or traces that things left. So, some of the early evidence of life is actually traces of things that fed in the sediment without a whole lot of the original left.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I never thought of these other things. Like, I guess if I was to say I'm a general member of the public, you always see the fossils, like they're the most exciting part, especially.
Dinosaur skeletons are the obvious ones, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of on this follow-up about fossils, like how old really is a fossil? I guess there's a big range. So what does it kind of entail?
Yes, and they can be very, very, very old, or not very old. And I guess there's sort of a gray area between what might just be, say, an old skeleton that one finds and a fossil. But in principle, of the youngest fossils might only be 1,000 years old. You might call it a fossil, and arguably even younger than that. Sometimes people use the word subfossil, like it's almost a fossil but not quite a fossil, for that kind of gray area. And then they go back sort of almost literally to the earliest life on Earth. Of course, we know the earliest life on Earth from the oldest fossil, which is, actually I don't know off the top of my head, but say about 2 billion years old.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay.
Most of them, actually, is worth saying, most of them were animals or plants that lived in the last 520 million years, which is really when different groups of organisms started to get things that you would call a skeleton in some ways, whether it's like our skeleton or a shell of a clam or something like that. And that's what, of course, makes most of the fossils. And before that, any of the organisms that lived didn't have those skeletons.
Yeah, so there was nothing that really could be fossilized.
Not easily anyway. Yeah. So there are only special circumstances older than that.
Are fossils always from extinct animals, or can they be also from extant species?
Most fossils are from extinct animals or plants, but many living species have fossil record too.
Yeah, I guess like humans.
Humans are definitely a good example.
Yeah. Also, probably are there some like shark fossils, because those are
and some of them from living species of shark, and some of them from completely extinct sharks. But for example, brown bears have a fossil record.
So When you look at fossils, what can you tell about the environment that they lived in just based on the fossils?
What a good question. There are all sorts of things that one might be able to tell. And I guess if you think about any living organism, plant or animal, most of them can't live just anywhere. If it's a plant, they might have preferred soil types, or preferred levels of moisture or sunlight or something like that. For animals, where they live might be determined by their body size, or whether they can climb trees and thus live and flourish in a forest, or run fast and flourish in open steppe or something like that. So if you know a little bit about how those structures relate to the environment, then if you find a fossil one and you find the same structures in it, then you can maybe say something about the environment.
Okay,
Yeah.
so like the kind of, how do I say, like the structures of the bones, or like how the kind of joints of an animal, or kind of what is it, these kind of things that you can use to infer about the environment.
And if you think about two animals that most people might know about, like a horse compared to a bear, bears are reasonably good at climbing, even though they're big, and that's partly because paws with claws and different fingers, and they can position their feet in different ways and climb up something, whereas a horse, because it's got a hoof that can't really grab anything, the leg is really long and thin and can't turn in various directions. A horse can't really climb anything like even remotely like a tree. They can scramble up the side of a hill, of course. And so sometimes it's just kind of the logic going from the bones to what kind of movements could it make, and therefore what kind of environment might it have done better in.
So from the bear, you'd kind of, like, say, some fossil old species of a bear, you would assume that, or like you would infer that maybe it's living kind of in a forest type thing, or...
Yeah, potentially. Of course, bears can be out in the open, but they can also live in the forest. And horse can go in the forest, but they would each do better in either a forest environment or a open environment.
Yeah, makes sense, actually.
I guess teeth are a pretty good indicator as well of what sort of environments they have lived in as well.
Sometimes, yes. And of course, teeth are good indicators of what you might have eaten.
Yes.
A cat's teeth, not the ones right at the front that are nipping things, but the ones towards the back, the molar teeth. Cats are simple in certain ways. They're kind of like knives or scissors. They've got a big flat surface that when the animal closes its mouth, it closes like a scissors, or actually like a guillotine, the thing to decapitate people, because they're V-shaped and they come across so they can catch the meat in between. But they wouldn't be really good at chewing lettuce, for example, because they can just cut through it, but they can't really chew it. Whereas a horse's teeth are all quite flat in a general sense. They're all about the same height. And then they've got little ridges, almost like a vegetable grater, if you're grating vegetables. And so the teeth, you can tell a lot about the diet. Sometimes the diet varies with the environment. And if so, then the teeth also tell you about the environment. So an animal there would be features of teeth that would tell you whether an animal might have eaten a lot of fruit. And of course, a lot of fruit is going to be found in certain kinds of environments and not in other environments. So not in the tundra, for example, but more likely in a tropical forest. Whereas something like a horse, its teeth are for a lot of grass, and so you would expect that in certain environments and so on.
Yeah. And I guess if I was to think about, it was a bit hard to picture it, but like say where you find the fossil, of course the environment where you find it is completely different from, or it could be completely different to what it was when this animal was living.
Yes.
So I guess you actually find quite a lot of fossils like in the tundra or the Arctic or these kind of places where it's like much easily preserved. But of course, is it the case that this environment would not have been like that?
Yes. Partly, of course, depends on the age of the fossils. So ones that are not so geologically old, the environment might not have changed all that much.
Okay.
But yes, the older ones, the environment may have been really radically different. And some things, of course, you can also tell about the environment, not just from the fossil, but from the rocks that it's embedded in.
Yeah.
things you can know from that, just say from the kind of texture or the type of rock, sometimes whether it was dry or wet, is an easy thing. And then there's other kinds of chemical signatures in the rocks that you can use to infer something about the temperature or humidity or various things like that too, as well as the age, of course.
Yeah, it's very interesting that like a rock, which some people might think is just a rock, or like a fossil, for example, that you can gain so much information from something that's so old, and also like the situation and kind of like the area that's found and everything can really give you a lot of insight into the past. I guess this actually leads into the next question, which is like, so from the fossils that you then can picture the area or the environment it was in, based on the things that you've mentioned. Can we also use this to predict things about, say, for example, the future, or in regards to climate change, or how this might be linked?
Yes, potentially, because certainly in the fossil record, we can find things that became extinct, we can find things that adapted, and through analyzing the patterns across lots of different fossils and lots of different species, you can calculate, for example, what the rate of extinction was, how many species were becoming extinct per million years, for example, and that's how it was first recognized, major mass extinctions versus sort of quote-unquote regular or background extinctions, as they're sometimes called. And by studying how one species is related to another and how they have changed and how that relates to the environment, you can also get an idea of how organisms have adapted to environments and the speed at which they do that. And in that sense, yes, you can, since we're going, potentially poised on a major climatic shift now, you could potentially use, or people are using, the fossil record and the geological record to ask, is this happening faster than it has in the past? Which the answer is yes, many times, many times faster than it has in the past. Is it a bigger change than in the past? And the answer to that one is it's bigger than some, but it's not as big as there have been. And then if you know questions like that, you can say, well, are there places in the fossil record where the climate changed mostly by temperature at a very fast speed, about this much? And if so, did most things survive? Did most things become extinct? Did they get reorganized into new ecological communities? Did they adapt? Those sorts of things.
Okay. One question based on when you mentioned the mass extinctions, and this is kind of just a question based from childhood. So with the dinosaurs, it always goes back to the dinosaurs when fossils are involved, I guess. Is it known what caused the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, or is it theoretical?
No,
it's always theoretical.
Yes,
it's
it's complicated.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, yes. And that extinction is one of what are usually counted as 5 major mass extinctions that have happened in the history of life. And it's the most recent one, 66 million years ago. And it was definitely capped off by a collision of an asteroid with the Earth, which hit in what is today the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and had a major effect, and took out the last... and there's always, since I'm a paleontologist, there's always sort of lots of technical caveats, but it basically took out the last of what I would say would call the terrestrial dinosaurs, because birds are also dinosaurs and birds survived. So it took out most of the last of the dinosaurs, and many other things. It was not the biggest mass extinction that ever happened. In fact, in some ways, for the mass extinctions, it was a sort of an ordinary level one. The biggest was just before dinosaurs evolved, 250 million years ago, called the Permian and Triassic extinction. And at that one, some estimates are that that as much as 95% of all species on Earth died. Plant and animal. And it really reset things in a way that the asteroid didn't, in some sense.
Do you know why that was such a big one then, or is it?
Yes, essentially more causes. The question you asked was, do we know what caused the extinction? So the asteroid was a major cause, but there were also other things going on that probably made that particular impact worse. Because there's also been other times that asteroids or meteor hit the Earth. Yeah. In fact, sometimes big ones that don't necessarily cause an extinction. So there's also a conjunction of other things going on. Yeah. The really big one was a combination of change in continents, partly what we call continental rifting. All the continents had come together into a big one, and they were starting to break apart. And when they break apart, that's caused by molten material below rising up. And when the continent breaks up, it rises up to the surface, and it off-gasses a lot of things. So it contributed to a runaway greenhouse effect. It also contributed to changes in the ocean circulation and changes in the atmospheric circulation, and a whole cascade of things that made the Earth a really different place afterwards than it was before.
And follow-up question on that. Do you know anything about the species before that mass extinction? Like, was there still, like, evolved species then?
Yes. In fact, probably a lot of people know what they usually think is a dinosaur, which is a lizard-like thing with a big sail on its back called Dimetrodon. And that is not a dinosaur, and it's one of the organisms that lived before that extinction. It's actually more closely related to us mammals, though it's a distant relative.
So, interesting. Yeah, I guess things get grouped as dinosaur when it looks different to what we would see now in a very basic.
Especially it looks like a reptile.
Yeah, a childhood toy collection, you know. So called the dinosaurs.
I had a thought. I once watched this documentary about these like extinction waves. And there was actually something a little bit soothing about it. Basically, a huge percentage of the organisms on Earth has been destroyed so many times. And always, somehow, there's a little bit of life that somehow starts to like go into new directions. And yeah, I think that's kind of beautiful in a way, if you want to put it in an optimistic.
Right. Because it is certainly the case, whatever is happening with humans on the Earth and anthropogenic climate change, that life will persist. Just a question of
us, but some other form of life.
Questions about our own civilization. Chances are there are so many of us, and we are so good at doing things to survive that even humans will survive. What else survives and what the ecosystems look like is a different question, and what our ability to sustain a civilization looks like. Those are kind of the open questions, probably.
Actually, it kind of leads to the next question, which, going back to the study of the fossils, can you use these to actually predict evolution or, like future evolution? So if we're thinking about climate change and the current species, can you use this to infer what might happen from the past for the current species?
To a limited extent, and predicting what happens based on the past in this sense is not a straightforward thing, like predicting how high a rocket will go based on how much fuel is expended. But certainly things you can look at are, one of them, the rates. So you can look at the past and ask the question, well, we would see environments changing at a certain rate. Was it faster situations where more things became extinct? And if so, how does the rapidity of change now fit in that? Or was it the absolute magnitude of it? Was it going from one extreme to a really big extreme? How do we fit in that? And those sorts of things. But also, can also be a little bit more specific than that too. So we were talking about the bear and the horse. To some extent, with climate prediction, do have a range of scenarios of what's likely and what's not likely for climates in 100 years, for example. And some of those might favor, taking the example of forest versus grassland, some of those changes might favor forest. And if so, then you would favor the organisms that have adaptations to it. And the Arctic is a good example of an environment where it's probably not going to be favored, and so things that have adaptations to that might fare worse. Those kinds of things you can start to parse, and some of that's just logic, but you can also then verify it in the distant past. Did it really play out that way? Because there's always the question, things in the Arctic, if they can adapt fast enough, then they might survive. And so then you can also use the fossil record to ask the question, how fast do things adapt, and how much adaptation is actually necessary, and what rates have things adapted, and is that realistic or not realistic?
Yeah, and in terms of like time, how long does it take? I mean, this is maybe a very general question, but I guess for like a mammal, because for bacteria, it's all these kind of like other smaller living organisms, they can adapt very fast, as we know, through the countless COVID vaccinations we had from viruses. But for example, with mammals, how long does it take them to adapt? Is it?
It would depend on the kind of adaptation. So evolution can happen pretty fast in the sense that you can measure things that are changing pretty fast. And by pretty fast, usually you're talking about changes that happen over generations.
Okay.
So a really fast change would be something that happens over a very small number of generations. And in mammals, there's all sorts of things that you can measure about the skeleton or their body size or whatever that can change pretty fast over some generations. And dogs and dog breeds are an example of how fast, because you can get some pretty extreme changes with intentional selection over X number of generations. But the differences between a Chihuahua and a Saint Bernard dog is not just a few generations. And if you think about the length of a generation of a dog, it's probably it's going to be about a year between the time a puppy is born and by the time it can have puppies. It's going to be a year to 2 years probably.
It's not the lifespan. I was thinking it's the lifespan.
So if you needed 50 generations, you're talking about at least 50 years, and some of it can be quick, but at the same time, what's happening to the Earth right now is also pretty quick because 100 years is only 100 dog generations and 3 or 4 human generations or 3 or 4 whale generations or something like that.
So moving back, I guess is more of a personal question from your career before we go into your actual research more specifically. But I guess you've collected many fossils during your career, but from these, what was your favorite that you collected, or what were you most excited about?
Yeah, I haven't collected nearly as many fossils as some paleontologists have, but I certainly have, and especially earlier in my career, I did quite a bit of it, and most of that was actually collecting in the period, the Mesozoic period, in the Cretaceous, which is when dinosaurs lived. So I was mostly interested in mammals, but they're rare at that point. So I found mostly dinosaurs, probably. It's hard to say which one. I guess there's all sorts of different levels of finding. Probably the most interesting one that I've helped excavate out of the ground was a baby Triceratops. I did not find it. And it was excavated out over a couple of seasons by teams from Montana and from University of California, where I was. And it's now, I believe, I'm not sure if it's housed at University of California, Berkeley, or at the Museum of the Rockies. But anyway, a baby Triceratops was pretty cool.
And was this was it excavated in the California area?
No, in Montana, in what's called the Hell Creek Formation, which is a rock formation that records the time when the asteroid hit. So it's it was among the last of the dinosaurs. It was not the last, but it was among the last.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. Because in the UK, where I'm from, there's a region on the coast which you might know. I can't remember what's called this part of the coastline where there's loads of fossils.
The southern
footprints.
The dinosaur.
Is it in the Isle of
Skye?
Is it?
I'm not sure.
Maybe
it's
I'm wrong.
I think in the south area.
Right. Certainly the south coast of England has a lot of fossils, particularly Jurassic aged. Some dinosaurs, but also mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs, the marine ones.
I remember being on the beach and you can see not the big ones, but people do look just not necessarily paleontologists, like us hobbyists, but you can see the little shell creatures, on the rocks, and you can just smash the rocks. It's really cool, actually, especially when you're a kid, because then you're like, wow. Oh God. Yeah, I think it's one of these things that I think when you see them in the museum, it's cool. But when you can see even a little small one and you find it yourself, it's really
lucky kids.
Yeah, exciting. I think it's quite unique.
And unfortunately, Finland is kind of an exception because there are very few fossils in Finland. But most places, most rocks have fossils in them if you bother to look and know what you're looking at.
At the floor.
Is it look around you. Is it that the Finnish sort of, what is it called? Ground? Yeah.
Sediment.
It's the sediments. It's more acidic, or was that the thing?
No, it's two things. Finland is sitting on a piece of continent that's really quite old. And because of its location far to the north, a lot of glaciation has happened here during the ice ages, which to some extent removed other younger rocks off of it. So most of the ones here are some sort of either what we call igneous rock, which were formed directly by crystallization from molten material, either underground slowly or above ground, or they're metamorphic rocks, which are basically ones that were heated so much that they melted and recrystallized, which typically don't have fossils. And it's so-called sedimentary rocks, which are ones that were carried by rivers or wind or landslides or something that do. And there just aren't that many deposits of those here.
Yeah. We're taught a lot about the Ice Age and like how the glacier movements like affected our environment, but I've never thought about how it would affect the fossils.
I think I know this to be true. There are fossil deposits in places like Estonia that at one time were probably in Finland, but they got pushed, bulldozed south. I think a lot of the amber deposits from Estonia, and amber is an example of fossil. It's fossil resin from trees.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Cool to know.
Like that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And for better or worse, Norway and Sweden actually do have a lot of fossils. The underlying geology was different. So
mountains as well. That also is not in Finland. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to, I guess, more specifically your research itself. Was there like a main species that you were focused on during your research, or you were still looking into?
I think due to having been a paleontologist for a long time, I've worked on lots of different groups of organisms, but my own specialty are mammal carnivores.
Okay, yeah, I guess we all maybe have heard the carnivore is the animal that eats meat. Is it they only eat meat?
Yes. In general terms, the word carnivore means a meat eater.
Yeah.
And in my case, I don't necessarily work on all mammals that eat meat, nor do all the ones I work on necessarily eat meat, but it's a technical group called the carnivora, which is usually called carnivore for short, which includes dogs and bears and raccoons and weasels and seals, actually, cats, hyenas, civets.
So it's quite broad.
So it's a pretty broad group, and most of them at least eat some meat. But when you get into things like bears or some of the civets, they may eat mostly vegetable matter.
Yeah, the vegetarian carnivores.
Yep.
Which
thanks to taxonomy, is a thing that can be the case. And sometimes, you're speaking really technically, I might use the word carnivorun instead of carnivore, which is an attempt to make the distinction, but that I'm talking about the taxonomic group as opposed to the diet category.
And why specifically carnivores?
I started working with them because I just liked them.
Yeah.
They're interesting. But they were also good for in my early career, the kind of research I was interested in, which was phylogeny, or how different species are related to each other, which basically can be done on any group. They have some advantages and some disadvantages, depending on what you're studying. But if you're studying patterns in the fossil record, and like we were just talking, adaptations to climate, they're good in a sense, because they do have lots of different kinds of locomotor and dietary adaptations that you can infer as fossils, though they tend to be rare because they're high on the food chain, so they were rare in the original environments, and which means they're even rarer in the fossil record. So sometimes sample sizes are not huge if you're measuring variation or something like that.
Actually, about that, this kind of goes back to the past and to the mass extinction waves. I've heard that the first mammals to kind of appear after the latest extinction wave were like herbivores, wasn't it? And as a continuation,
go on with the question.
Like, what are the oldest kind of carnivores? What are the oldest fossils of carnivores after the latest extinction?
Right. And I guess it depends on what's actually in your mind is the latest extinction. Of the mass extinctions, the latest one is the one that killed off the dinosaurs.
Yeah, I think
and right. Herbivores certainly appeared soon after that, but so too did all sorts of other groups.
Okay.
So not just herbivores. The mammals that survived that were dominantly insectivores, small ones, but also some that were probably may have been eating nuts or something else. They were a type of herbivore. And they were called multituberculates. And later they became completely extinct, so they're not around anymore, but they did survive. Yeah. And soon after that extinction, that became the age of mammals, so to speak.
Yeah.
And within 5 million years, you started to get really different kind of mammals, and within 10 million years you started to get even as extreme as bats and whales.
Okay.
But one could also argue the most recent extinction is only, so that one was 65 million years ago, roughly 10,000 years ago, 10 to 15, 10 to 18,000 years ago was also what's often called the megafaunal extinction, and that's when mammoths, for example, became extinct, and dire wolves became extinct, and saber-toothed cats became extinct.
Ice Age creatures.
And
the famous paleontological.
Partly related to humans, and that one mostly took big animals and mostly took big herbivores, but also, I just listed off some carnivores in there too.
What happened then that made the animals extinct?
Humans joined the ecosystem. And also, like with the asteroid, it's more complex than that, because it was also the end of the last glacial cycle. The environments were changing really fast, so there was a lot of change going on anyway. But on the other hand, there were 10 to 15 glacial cycles that ended in a very similar way, which didn't cause the same extinction. And that was also the time that modern humans, depending on how one uses the word modern, were spreading around all the continents and also becoming a carnivore in an ecosystem that already had its own carnivores, and probably just enough to tip the balance that some of the big ones became extinct, and the carnivores that preyed on them became extinct, and so on.
And just to clarify, what do you mean by glacial cycle?
The last 2 million years, that's a really good question. The last 2 million years are when people talk about ice ages. That's what comes to my mind.
Yeah.
And what probably isn't widely known is it wasn't just a time when it was cold, but it's actually been a series of time where it alternated between colder and warmer. And generally speaking, even today, is relatively cold compared to a lot of Earth history.
Oh.
So the fact that we have ice sheets on Antarctica and on Greenland is because the Earth's climate is pretty cold. There's most of Earth's history you wouldn't have had any ice like that. And so, over putting this even larger context for a second, when the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, the Earth was really, really warm.
Okay.
So that period when all of those mammals were diversifying, the Earth's climate on average may have been something like 12, 14 degrees C warmer than it is today.
Okay. What's the average today?
It is about 14 degrees C.
Okay. Oh wow!
So it's almost in the 20s.
That's hot.
And yes, and so for example, in what's now Greenland and the very north part of Canada, Ellesmere Island, and places like that, there were basically tropical forests living.
Wow.
But weird tropical forests, because you get above the Arctic Circle and it's dark part of the year. And so they were deciduous, seasonal tropical forests. But you had snakes and monkeys and things that lived there. From that time, not exactly steadily, but nevertheless progressively, it got colder and colder. Which then about 2.5 million years ago, it got cold enough to start having ice on continents like Antarctica. And it's also cold enough, and actually I should say one of the reasons for that is there was a drawdown in greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide and methane concentrations really went down over that period for various reasons. And that took us into a threshold where astronomical or planetary cycles kicked in. And sometimes the Earth is closer to the sun, sometimes it's further away from the sun, sometimes one hemisphere is spending more time pointed towards the sun, sometimes the southern hemisphere is pointing more towards the sun. And those then create cycles where it's either a bit warmer or a bit cooler, and it's just on the threshold where it either the bit cooler means a lot of ice advances, spreads, and a bit warmer means it retreats. So we've gone through that kind of a cycle a dozen times or so. 5 really major ones.
Okay, so that's the
And so
glacial cycle.
heretofore we have been in what is called an interglacial cycle.
Okay.
And until recently, we would have expected that soon, meaning over 5,000 years or so, we would have gone back into a glacial cycle,
Okay.
which probably will not happen.
Because of the climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah. Very interesting to hear all the background of like how the Earth's climate has been before, because I think you hear a lot about how it's going to change now, but not so much actually about what it was like before.
And I guess from the point of view of a paleontologist or a geologist, one of the worrying things is we're in kind of an unusually cool period anyway, and it is definitely possible to change a lot in the warmer way.
Yeah.
And nobody would want to go back to what it was like 50 million years ago when all of those mammals were radiating.
Yeah.
And then you had tropical forest in Greenland. It just would not, none of the kinds of plants that we use now would work in that kind of environment.
Yeah. And I guess
And at least so far, we're not likely to go, even with the worst carbon dioxide emission. Probably won't take us quite back to there, but it could take us to a very different place.
Yeah. I guess that links into the question about like your actual research. What is it looking into? Is it kind of doing these predictions to use, like you just mentioned there, from the previous times, or like knowing these kind of glacial cycles, so when it was getting colder and warmer, to predict how it might change, as you mentioned, with the different plants, if in different scenarios of climate change, or how much hotter it can get?
Yeah, a lot of my research has been figuring out ways to measure change, both in the fossil record and now, so that they can be compared. And all the kinds of changes we were just talking about, particularly the kinds of adaptations, how can you measure those kinds of adaptations instead of just describing them? How could you then measure the rate at which they're happening? And some of that is involved, like three-dimensional analysis of, like scanning a fossil and getting 3D and then measuring the shapes and contours of that, and then using sort of multivariate methods to then trace out the changes over time as measured with the fossils, and what rate has that happened at, or the rates of extinction, or how closely does the adaptation match the environment, and how fast is the environment changing, and therefore how fast we expect the other to change. That's sort of been, those kinds of things have been the core of my research.
I guess with when you mention the technology side of things, like 3D scanning of fossils and things, I guess this is a very new way of looking at fossils.
Yes, certainly the rise of computer power over the last 25 years or 30 years, and I guess going back further than that, the last 60 years, and then all the other kinds of technology like scanning technology or processing power is part of what goes into analyzing big three-dimensional data sets, or huge data sets that are global data sets. So yes, it's been really transformed the kinds of questions that can be asked. Because of course people measured things.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You get kind of
150 years ago, people measured things.
Information, or different information, maybe is better.
But rather than just taking out a ruler and how big is this fossil, you can measure other sorts of things.
So, David, these new technologies, how would you use these to measure what's happening now or in the near future specifically?
Yeah, so some of it, taking the example of the bear and the horse, you can use the scanning to measure not very specific things about their skeleton. So if you're thinking about how they move in the environment, a lot of what controls how we move our limbs are details of the wrist structure or the ankle structure, and how the bones fit together, and are they like a hinge or not like a hinge. So you can scan those, measure them in 3 dimensions, measure how they fit together, and then do that across a whole lot of species, and then figure out what are the features that we see that are related to being able to climb, or to being able to run fast, or what have you. And then doing that in all the species that are in a community, say a forest community in Finland versus a steppe community in the Ukraine versus some sort of a temperate forest community in the Mediterranean. What species are able to persist in that environment? And with all of that sort of information, then you can measure some of the things I described. What is the rate of change in those structures themselves, but also as the environment changes, which species end up being added to that community and which species ended up being subtracted to it. And that you can look at all sorts of different levels. So you can go back to that period when it was 12 or 14 degrees hotter than it is today, and you had tropical forests persisting all the way to the Arctic, and ask, well, what kind of features are there? What is their range of variability? And in this case, you can do that in a quantitative way. As that changed and you started to get grasslands later, what happened and at what rate? When you got Arctic tundra, what happened and at what rate? And then use that. And I've done some things with historical data. For example, areas where humans cleared forest. So a lot of eastern North America is that way. It was a huge forest, and most of it was cleared for agriculture in 30 or 40, 50 years. And look at the composition of the species that lived there before, the composition that lived there after, and then ask the question of the ones that disappeared, do their features match kind of the change in the environment, and put some numbers on that. And then using climate models, what are we expecting? So Finland, for example, presumably going to lose some of the tundra environment. Will it be replaced by forest? If so, then what kind of changes would we expect in the... those are the ways that the technology can come through. And what I just described between the 3D scans and the lots of species and lots of environments is just a huge data set.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you have fossils of creatures who have existed like million years ago and have not been around for a long, long time, for example, can you really use dinosaurs as a model to study what's happening now or in the near future?
Well, that's exactly one of the difficult things about the fossil record, or the challenging things, because the situation was always different in some fundamental ways. So you can't look at what happened to lions, because lions didn't exist then, for example. And we use something that we now call ecometrics, which is a kind of, it's been known as functional trait ecology, to deal with that. And what functional trait ecology is not looking at, for example, which species live together or which species are predator and prey per se, but really breaking it down into so-called functional traits, where a functional trait is a part of an organism that is functionally related to some part of its environment. Mammals, their hair would be a example of a functional trait that's related to temperature. So if you were in a cold environment, you would expect an animal that had thicker fur, for example, as insulation, and that would be an example of functional trait ecology. So you can break the organism down into traits, and if you can understand how the trait is related to different aspects of the environment, is it related to, for example, openness or roughness of terrain or temperature or the amount of water in the environment or something like that, then you can make those comparisons regardless of which species. And so dinosaurs, even though they were incredibly different, nevertheless, they were made up of traits that help them in their environment. So you can basically do the same kind of thing, even though they're really different organisms and the environments themselves were quite different.
Okay. So you use the kind of like the relationship with that particular species and the environment, and that relationship you compare to today, rather than, as you mentioned, the species itself, you know, like how the species might adapt. But for example, how, the example you mentioned with the hair or the fur, if it's thicker, then, you know, how did that species or that fossil species adapt or not adapt in that environment, and then use that for the species that are similar today. That makes a lot of sense.
And presumably that's what will determine the success or lack of success for a species is, do its features allow it to flourish in a changed environment or not, and if so, which of those features and what aspect of the environment, and so on.
And have you had any main findings in this research that you've been able to use to predict, say, a certain species or a certain group of species in their response to what might happen in the future with climate change?
Yeah, in my own specific research on carnivores and their locomotion, some of those are that, yes, indeed, if you're in say, a forest environment versus a grassland environment versus a tundra environment, the locomotor traits do differ between those environments on average across the species. So you can really see the pattern in a way you might not expect, given that a lot of carnivores are really widespread. So brown bears, for example, we have them in Finland. Once upon a time, they would have been in the UK. They stretch all the way. So what are known as grizzly bears are a group of brown bears. They're spread in all sorts of different environments. But nevertheless, on average, the kinds of traits you find in the species that inhabit a particular place, you can measure. And that's one thing that we've found in my group. And then also, a few of the examples I gave earlier, we've looked at the amount of change you would get in these traits in the deeper past, when there was sort of a long, gradual climate change. We've looked at them in the glacial and interglacial cycles, where the pace was much faster. And also then in historical data, where the pace was really fast. Interestingly, I mentioned the deforestation, or the removal of forest from eastern North America, I think, which was cleared between about 1800 and 1870, or 1800 and 1900. The amount of change in carnivore traits between that forest originally and then later is about the same as between a glacial period and an interglacial period. Wow. So you can start to put a order of magnitude on it.
Okay. So the carnivores that, like, the things that you found with the carnivores, the research you found with the carnivores, and their joint movement, or the ankle movement, as you mentioned, how does this predict how can you use this to predict how much change? Is it that they become slower or less agile, or? Well,
in some sense, they have responded to the new environment. And some of the change that I'm describing there. Well, actually, another important thing we found, this was especially a student who worked with me, a PhD student named Michelle Lawing, who's now at Texas A&M University as a professor. She tried to really break down the ways in which organisms can respond. So if the environment changes, one way you can respond is by going somewhere else where your environment is still okay. So you would track your environment, so to speak, or you could adapt. And in her case, she was working on rattlesnakes, which are also endangered, and used the glacial and interglacial cycles, which are pretty rapid, and they've happened several times. So she broke it down into how fast did they adapt to these new glacial environments versus how fast did they move. And did a few things so that she could convert those two things into the same unit so the numbers are comparable, and found that over that period, the rate of adaptation has been really slow, and they have mostly responded by tracking the climate. And then also, on top of that, using climate models, showed that in order to respond by tracking, they would have to move at, I think it was like an order of magnitude 10 to 20 times more than they have in the past.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And the chances of them actually adapting to it, responding by adapting, is essentially impossible.
Okay. Yeah. Wow, so it's quite concrete. Findings, like it sounds.
And it's not exactly a prediction per se, but it is sort of getting some constraints on what could happen, what couldn't happen.
Yeah, that's actually interestingly kind of links to this episode we did with Katja Rönge, who studies reed warblers, and then she talked a lot about how actually the fastest kind of adaptation is a behavioral one instead of like one by genetics and etc.
And with the in this research with the snakes, when you're using the kind of old fossil data and with this tracking, so that with the snakes moving from area to area in their like preferred climate, is there then like multiple fossils in the different areas that you link together, kind of thing?
Yeah, and her work was done partly with fossils, but fossils are in some sense rare, especially if you're after a fossil of a particular species of snake, and they're also not spread everywhere. That the animals would have lived. So basically the way she did it was partly with modeling of where where ought the species range to have been given the change in climate and given what we know about its relation to climate now, and then use the fossils as sort of a verification. Are the fossils actually found where her model predicted that they were? And then in that case they were. So that gave confidence in the model that that you could then calculate rates from it.
Yeah. So you use, actually, it goes the other way around as well. Like you mentioned that you use the knowledge of the animal today to also help predict the movements or how the species was acting in the past.
Yeah, and that's essentially what the value of the fossil record is you can kind of test then if we have a model that we think we know how they ought to respond, we can then project that model into the past as well to see is that actually how they responded? Is the model correct or not correct?
Okay.
Yeah. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So this question is a bit more of a personal one. How did you get into this field of paleontology?
Pretty much by accident, I guess. And when I was a little kid, I liked dinosaurs, as many kids do, but then I grew out of that and had no interest in them whatsoever, and went to university to study something else, English and history, probably. I wasn't completely sure. And at some point took a class where it was actually about human evolution and realized there were all sorts of interesting things I didn't know about, and from that took a paleontology class, and from that did a project and then applied to a PhD program and got in, and that's sort of how it happened.
Yeah. I guess that's with most people. It's very rare to find somebody who, when I was 5, I always wanted to do this. I think it's actually nice to kind of fall into your career in a way that you build on it. You know, like you say, you start doing something different and then you're like, oh, this is interesting. And then from there you go, oh, this is quite interesting. And, you know.
And I think it's kind of nice to see that you don't always need to know everything immediately.
Yeah.
Like your career will find its path eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now you're over here in Helsinki as a visiting professor. How did that come about?
There are a lot of people here who are interested in similar sorts of things as me, including the ecometrics and functional trait ecology. In some ways, it kind of originated here with Mikhail Fortelius, who's now retired professor of paleobiology. Who did a lot of work on traits and environments, and particularly with herbivore teeth. But then there's other people who are interested in other kinds of things that I am. Yarnval on teeth and development and evolution, and Andres Liberti on computational approaches to paleontology. So all of that together makes it a really nice place for me to be, even though Finland is unusual and not having any fossils, but a really good paleo program.
Yeah.
Well, during your career in paleontology, have you had a lot of experiences in science communication?
I suppose so. It's, I guess, also accidental in some ways. Of course, a lot of people love fossils, including dinosaurs. So I think paleontologists get asked or have opportunities to talk to people that are maybe easier than some kinds of science, whether that's being asked to come talk to some school kids or something along those lines. I never, unlike your group, I never had any real training in it. And another thing that happened more or less by accident, when I was a PhD student and was supposed to be writing my dissertation, there was this new thing related to the internet, and the internet had been around for a while, like it's email or file sharing or whatever. But there was this new thing that we suddenly heard about called the World Wide Web. And so I set up my friends and I set up a server for the University of California Museum of Paleontology, and to some extent we're chastised for wasting our time. But it was one of the first 50 to 100 websites ever.
Wow.
And they just happened to take off at that time, and ours had a lot of pictures of dinosaurs, so it was very popular. But we really, in doing that, we really tried to mix science with outreach in a way that would be that would sort of help explain the technical parts of the science that we thought were really important in a way that would be accessible to people, so that they could read a little bit about the general context and then see the research in a very specific way.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good way to procrastinate.
Writing
your dissertation.
Make a website.
Yes.
I mean, it's quite really cool because when these things are new.
My next 2 jobs, other than a postdoc, were we're direct outgrowths of that. It was also a good backup plan.
Nice.
Yeah, it's very like now, people just, websites exist, you wouldn't think to
Yeah.
make one,
Yeah.
so it's quite cool, like
Yeah.
the first like
In fact, it's really weird to think back and how much it's changed
Yeah.
because 50 to 100 websites. I would bet it's entirely possible that in the average building on this university campus, there are 50 to 100
Yeah.
different websites
Exactly.
running on computers
yeah,
there. And when we were putting it together, and several times when we redesigned it, we could look at every single website
Yeah.
and say, how did they do it? How did they do it? How did they do it? What can we do better? In fact, I was offered some point, I got an email from some people wanting to know if I wanted to come work for them. And it was a company that had a really weird name and they wanted to index the web. And I thought, why would you index it? You can just look at it. What would you search for? And that company was named Yahoo, which later became quite big.
It's quite a weird name though, especially if I was to get an email from an unknown random company called Yahoo, I'd be like, what? Yeah, that's
More or
funny.
less at the time said, no, thank you.
Yeah. yeah. Wow, interesting. And then I guess based on this science communication, to you, what is the most important part of communicating your research and outreach, different various things you've done?
What a good question. I mean, in some ways, what I just said about the website, there's a lot, especially with concern about climate change. I don't actually have a whole lot of experience talking about it here, but in the U.S., talk about it in public, you usually get some pushback from somebody and who says, well, isn't all that just models, or there's background variation, isn't it just background variation? And the thing about paleontology is then say what the background variation is. We do know something about it, and trying to, in some ways, to communicate how those things that we predict for the future or even measure in the present, how do they really fit into that picture?
Yeah, I guess it's with such kind of topical topics like climate change, it is a lot about understanding what people don't understand as well, or what they don't always grasp, or these kind of concepts which are, I think a lot of miscommunications in with science comes from concepts which are real but just haven't been fully understood. Like you say, with these changes in variation or the modelling, of course there's always some error, or there's like a margin of error, like in all science you prove something happens, but it can always be like proven again, or something can change. Like even in my field, which is like cellular biology, you prove that this thing is expressed, but maybe actually it's the way it's expressed is targeted or changed through something else, which you then find out later on. So it's not necessarily that it's not true, but and I think this is the thing that's often lost in this communication, the kind of the not the true or false, it's the kind of depth, or the,
and being able to explain those things in a way and keep the conversations on track in a way that they don't get mired in that. And actually, Finland's probably think of saying something which I can say at home, and I think you can also say here in Helsinki, that if you go back 18,000 years, there were a couple of kilometers thick ice where we're sitting right now. And the difference between then and now is about 7 degrees C global temperature, and that's what we're talking about in climate change. So if you go from, if that amount takes you from several kilometers thick ice here to the present, that is a big change. It's not just a few degrees.
Yeah. I think these kind of visualization and showing people really what the actual effect is in these kind of like right now and right here, like this. I remember there was some art exhibition at the Helsinki Biennial, I think last 2 years ago, and it was this in at like one of the islands surrounding Helsinki, and it was this kind of like structure that they built that was like how the sea level will rise, and it was massive. And like when you're stood there, like, because you hear it, it'll rise by 30 meters, and you're, or 20 meters or 10 meters, whatever. And then when you see it, it is a very different. It does resonate in a very different way. Like when you have this visual, whether it be descriptive or actually like this in this kind of structure that they built, when you're literally standing next to the sea, and you see it there, is different. This kind of very interesting form of science communication in this way. and people can really understand
what the numbers actually mean.
Exactly,
in practice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's nice to hear about your different experiences with science communication. I guess to finish off, as we do with every episode, we ask you for your take-home message. So what would you like to give the take-home message to our listeners?
I guess actually as a variant on something both of you said just a few minutes ago, and especially thinking about people who are wanting to be scientists, but probably any kind of career is be flexible. Both the way that I got into things, but also how things like technology have changed over the time since I got my PhD. All sorts of new questions arise, all sorts of new ways of addressing them arise, and being flexible and being willing to take advantage of the new opportunities is probably lead you to be happier.
Yeah, that's a really nice take-home message. It's good to always remember this, even I think when you're in science. So even if doing a PhD, it's always good to remember. Sometimes you get very focused on the details of what you need to do. So it's always a good thing to remember the different opportunities that you might be offered or might come your way. Yeah. Okay, I think that's all. We've covered everything for today, and it was a very nice episode. So thank you, David, for taking the time to join us today at the Science Basement podcast. It's been really nice to learn all about the history of the Earth, let's say, and how this will affect and your research and how this has played into everything. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
And as a reminder for all the listeners, keep looking out for our new episodes on the podcasting platform of your choice. So goodbye from me, Rhiannon.
And goodbye from me, Emmi.
And this was the Science Basement podcast. And thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.
Science